Good afternoon. My name is Dina Novak, and I'm a senior instructional designer with Teaching and Learning with Technology. This session includes two presentations, the first beginning at 1 p.m. and the second at 1:25. Please use the live Q&A feature to ask any questions to our presenters, which will be addressed at the end of each presentation. On behalf of Rutgers University Online Learning Conference, I'm delighted to introduce our first presentation for this session. We have Shelley Buchbinder, Education and Training Specialist in the Rutgers School of Health Professions and lecturer in the School of Social Work, and Brian Dashew, Assistant Professor of Practice in the Department of Teaching and Learning at the Rutgers Graduate School of Education. We're pleased to have them present content curation using Wakelet to build information literacy. At the end of each presentation today, there'll be a short survey displayed, and any feedback you can provide is greatly appreciated. All right, over to you.
So hi, welcome everyone. And so as Dina said, we're going to be talking about the use of Wakelet to help students build information literacy. And so Brian and I both teach research methods courses to professional master's students. And in teaching research methods, we found a number of gaps and difficulties for students both in understanding and approaching and applying previous research studies and scholarship, but then also in producing their own research projects in classes. And so Brian actually introduced me to the content curation tool Wakelet, and both of us are using it in our research methods courses this semester. And so we're both going to speak about cases of the application of Wakelet, which will hopefully provide some possibilities for building stronger information literacy for students. So an overview of this quick presentation. So we're going to start by reconceptualizing information literacy to try to broaden the definition that's often used. Then we're going to briefly talk about the dissonance between faculty and student perceptions of information literacy and some gaps in information literacy for students. And then talk about the role of content curation in information literacy and specifically the tool Wakelet. And then both of us will present cases using Wakelet in assignments that we had previously done not using Wakelet. And then we're going to end with some musings and possibilities. We're just using it this semester, so we're giving you, in part observations because we're not actually done with the full assignments yet. So information literacy and the flood of information. So the problem of students lacking information literacy is often presented that students are overwhelmed by the noise of online content, right? There's so much content, they're searching it without necessarily understanding where it's coming from, its application. They're using inappropriate sources such as Wikipedia or non-peer-reviewed sources, and it's teachers' role to connect students to appropriate sources, which is almost always peer-reviewed sources. And that's kind of where the conversation ends, that once students are connected to those sources, they are literate to use them. And we want to kind of broaden this definition of information literacy to think about what students can be enabled to do once they're connected to sources. And that connection is really just the beginning. And so we want students to be able to evaluate content. So thinking about, is the content relevant? Is the content reliable? Also thinking about the context of the content. What larger conversation is it a part of? Who produced it? Who distributed it? Then also thinking about how to build and communicate arguments. And so thinking about not just listing information, which is something that both of us have talked about seeing, but then also thinking about, is this adding on to an existing theory? Is this building something new, an additional case? Like, what is the role of this? And the use of existing research and scholarship, and then to also differentiate types and purposes of research. And so if we're thinking about, for example, is this descriptive research? Is this research trying to, for example, be predictive in some way? What population can this be applied to? And what are limitations of it? And so in thinking about this broader definition of information literacy, we're taking this to current undergraduate and graduate students in the millennial and Gen Z populations who are often spoken of as digital natives. And so the expectations both of faculty, but then also of students of being digital natives is that there's an inherent information literacy of digital natives, right? They've grown up with technology, both in education and their social lives. It's very integrated into their lives. And there are often minimal introductory resources that are offered by both for undergraduates in their first year and also master's students in their first semester. So that kind of one period introduction from the library that shows people the ropes of the library resources, online databases, and then once they're connected, there's a reliance on self-education. Very similar to the flood of information. Once you connect people, they'll know what to do with the information that they've accessed. However, there's been consistent gaps that have been found, and so students struggle with basic information literacy across the spectrum from bachelor students to PhD students. And so in terms of basic information literacy, this goes back to not being able to talk about the context, to properly apply sources and to evaluate those sources, and that students are struggling with college level research, again, at all areas. It's been found that the first place that students go is Google for research. And it's not that there's anything wrong with Google or Google Scholar, right? Rutgers Library has Google Scholar access, but if students lack basic information literacy, they're not necessarily going to know what to do with the information that they found, how to evaluate it, how to put it in context and make it part of a larger argument. And so we're now going to talk about how we've seen this information literacy gap manifested in our students in our courses. So a few examples of this gap is that students ask questions that there are existing solutions. And part of this has to do with not understanding the context of sources. And so if people find one-off sources, they'll often not understand the larger disciplinary or research conversation that it's a part of. And so they'll kind of jump in without understanding the broader context and where the literature is. There's also an issue where there's a failure to understand the systems perspective. And so oftentimes the research project will not think about larger systems or the interplay between systems and just think about one specific component of a larger system. Also not seeing the utility in research. And I teach in the School of Social Work, and you hear this a lot from social work students, who many of whom want to go into private practice and for clinical work. And just seeing that there's no point in learning basics of research, being a consumer of research, even though evidence-based practices have become more common, and there's a large role for social workers in program evaluation. And then also not understanding types of sources and information. And this is something big that even if you, for example, connect a student to a peer-reviewed article, right? Is it original research? Is it a commentary? And then if you're thinking about different types of sources, there are issues, for example, for reports and the difference between a peer-reviewed article and a report, right? Who funded it? Is it government funded? Is it from a government agency versus a private foundation or a think tank? So having that level of evaluation. And then also listing sources without communicating an argument. And I just had a student last week during office hours who said that this is something she does, right? She has a really hard time making an argument out of sources instead of just listing them, which was great self-awareness and metacognition, but she was saying that she really needed some support to work on that. Okay, so now I'm going to turn things over to Brian.
Excellent. So with respect to content curation, there's this growing body of literature on content curation for information literacy to address some of the gaps that Shelley just identified. And in the research, there's this important distinction in discussing content curation, that when we're not talking about the creation of new content. Instead, what we're talking about is making sense of the content that currently exists out there in the world. So content curation comes from the art world and the museum world, but for about the last decade, it's also been applied as a skill for addressing the flood of information and content that exists out there on the internet. But just like in a museum where a curator is responsible for not only tending to the art, but also using it to communicate a story, to take that systems perspective we just talked about an artist or a movement, the content curator here needs to be doing more than just finding and collecting information. Antonio and Tuffley note the key functions of content curation are cataloging, accessing, and representing information. And that means that effective content curators need to be able to search for information that addresses a particular audience need or problem. And that means aggregating the multitude of sources available on the web and then filtering them to find relevant content, evaluating content for fit, but also for value and validity, selecting information that helps to form a coherent argument, and that organization of that material is really essential. And then lastly, presenting it. So organizing it, contextualizing it, and sharing it with whoever needs to see it. So that's sort of where we are. We can move to the next slide. So for our sake, then, we were looking for a tool that addressed these activity level and course level needs. We needed for our learners to be able to collect, annotate, organize, reflect on materials that are collected, and then share their content collections for feedback from us and from peers. And we needed to be able to do so in a course context that allowed for multiple iterations so that they could get successively closer to goal for a complex set of research skills that they didn't have prior to beginning our courses. That allowed for scaffolding to walk them through those research processes and procedures, that allowed for collaboration for peer feedback and community learning and feedback from their instructor, and that allowed for the possibility, as I just said, of feedback. And the tool that we found to do this was Wakelet. And as you'll see in a moment when we share our cases, Wakelet is a tool for aggregating information, for organizing it, that uses a clean and simple to use functionality, no real bells and whistles, and the ability to drag and drop. And it also allows for adding additional annotations that can help to contextualize the material that's being collected. Wakelet has a browser plugin, so you can use that to collect information from the web, bring it directly into your collection, and then using that drag and drop functionality, you can move things around. And as we talked about, this includes things like PDFs, it includes websites, but it also includes social things like tweets. You can create Flipgrid videos, and it also allows for learners to build their own elements into that collection, which we've both used for annotation and for reflection, and to help students think about the ways that they can organize those collections. The other feature that it has is a collaborative feature. So that allows for the instructor or for other peers to go in and add to a collection. And as you'll see in the work that we're going to talk about in a bit, it allows for for us to put in ideas and to challenge things that are in the collection so that learners can think about and iterate on the reflection on the collections that they've built. And so what we'd like to do now is share a bit about how we have made use of Wakelet in our classes. So I'll tell you about the use of Wakelet in my course on applied research for adult education. And then Shelley will share her own experiences using Wakelet in social work research. So for me, a bit of context. My course is part of our EDM in adult and continuing education in the Graduate School of Education. And it is the first half of a 2-course capstone sequence. The overall capstone project is the design of a training solution to meet an organizational learning problem. And in my class, what learners have to do is develop a needs assessment and then an evaluation plan on which they are going to build the training, and that takes place in the training design course, which is the second course in the capstone sequence. But part of the complexity of the course is that there is no traditional academic research course in the program. So I'm kind of laying the tracks while learners are working on the project, and I'm trying to explain to them why we do research, how we do research, and then giving them the chance to apply that to a project that's their culminating effort in the program. So to do this, I've tried a number of different things. I always start the course with a proposal that I can use to assess that learners have the scope correct on the project. And I get a lot of performance-based needs there when I do that. So we need a training because nobody has had this training before. Nobody knows how to use the software that we have. And I give a lot of feedback on this that helps them, I hope, to sort of take that more systems-oriented view. Because if we're going to spend a lot of time and money and effort on building a training, we need to be able to understand organizationally why it matters. Why does it matter that they don't know how to use the software package? I've also added a number of group assignments in which learners have to go through the process of defining a need together. I do a case study that orients them to the process, and I've done multiple rounds of peer review. But no matter what I've done to add to sort of giving them that scoping, the layers only seemed to deepen the problem for my students, and it made them more frustrated that they weren't understanding what I was saying about that zoom out, that need to zoom out and see a systems orientation or see what the organizational levels were. And all of that has led to me typically spending about the first 3 to 4 weeks of the semester, of a very short semester in the summer, but also at any time of year, trying to convince them that this level of movement is necessary, that they need to do that type of zoom out. And the points that Shelley referenced at the beginning really come into discussion for my students, come into play for my students. They're trying to use research to address a problem that has that already have solutions, and that they really have difficulty in understanding those systems perspectives. And typically when I ask students to look beyond the performance in the organization or outside of the organization, what I'll get is one of 2 responses. Either they will say, nobody else has built this training program before, and therefore that's evidence that it needs to exist. Or they will say somebody else has already built this solution, and therefore that proves that it needs to exist. And neither is really taking a research-oriented approach to solving the problem. And neither is really looking at what else is out there and using it to form a coherent argument. And so I really saw this need to identify a practice that could help students to zoom out, to form logical arguments, and to make these links between the organization's need, the performance need, and then what learning needs were built on that. And so now what I'm going to do is show what I built, what I had my students do. So this is my Wakelet board for a project that I created just to show them, to demonstrate to them what I was looking for. And in this particular project, I have this idea that we could create a certificate of agility work at the GSE. What I've done is collected resources. I found a bunch of resources about the future of work and the need to be strategic and the need to be agile. And then as I started adding in my reflections, you'll see this is an example of my reflection here, the changing world of work and of what I think the resources say. I found that I needed to ask another set of questions about what else existed already at the university and what else existed with competitive institutions, what the competitive landscape looked like. And so I was able to just add a number of resources, use these blocks of text to try to organize information, and then, as you can see, moving things, whoops, that's actually, but if I wanted to move things around, I just click the edit button and I can actually go in and just move sources around and try to change things. When I did this with my students, I had them all add me as a collaborator on this so that I could go in and move things around and add comments. And what that helped me to do was to add my own reflections on what I was seeing them collect. Or to say, you know what, I see that you are identifying this particular gap, but you seem to be missing something else over here. So for example, I had a student who was looking at a merger that had occurred in her organization, and half of the organization was not using the intranet for the organization. And she was writing a lot about that gap. And what I was able to do was suggest that she look at some resources on organizational culture, on mergers, on what it meant to be acquired by another organization. And that helped her to think more about what she was seeing in the organization and to reframe the scope of her project. So it allowed for some of those other capabilities that we're talking about here. Yeah, I think that's so this is just one use. It allowed me to scaffold a project for the students to give them a set of instructions. And you know, for this particular case, what it did in terms of helping me with my students is that they were able to do that zoom out much quicker. And typically, as I said, it's taken me 3 to 4 weeks to get to a point where I feel like all of the proposals are ready to go and students can begin to do research work or can begin to frame out research work. But here I was able to really easily say, we're ready to go at the end of the first week of the course.
So I'm just going to quickly talk about my case of using Wakelet in social work research methods. So my assignment's a little bit different. The students are using the General Social Survey Data Explorer to do an analysis of secondary data along the lines of interest to them in their current field placements. And the idea is they're learning to gain some literacy around using existing data and then applying it to their work, which is something that is trying to be built in social work, the skill of being able to take research and data and apply it to their clinical or practice work. And how I've done this previously is I had 5 scaffolded pieces that you can see here, and the students would submit each on Canvas or on the learning management system individually, and I'd offer feedback, but they were really held separately. And so what happened is that as things changed, as they looked in the literature, their variables maybe changed, the way they wanted to analyze things, and there wasn't really a way for them to be able to make iterations and have me able to see it and give feedback in a way that was streamlined. And so what I found was a number of students contacted me. Well, some people did update and change and scaffold and build their project and change it. A lot of students didn't and felt very frustrated and stuck with what their previous iterations had been. And so in using Wakelet, similar to Brian, I created a model. And so I came up with a research question. For me, it was the relationship between race and perception of the achievement gap. And I worked through all pieces of the scaffold. And the students created their own projects. You can see here they personalize them. So a lot of different topics: mental health and children in foster care, spirituality and addiction research. So lots of different topics. They shared it with me. And as they've submitted pieces of it, I've offered feedback in it. And it's created a visible scaffold where what they've been doing, they see my comments, they can then edit the pieces that they've done, which they've been doing, and then they can say, hey, can you take a look at this again? I can give feedback. And so there is this ability to give basically feedback and have them be able to feel that those pieces are still malleable, as opposed to submitted in the LMS and just sitting there static. And so that's been really helpful so far. I have had to add a lot of resources, tutorials, other things, spend a lot of class time to help people, because Wakelet was a little bit complicated. The use of collections was a little bit hard for some of the students at first, but we're definitely working through it now. So
2 minutes.
So just for the sake of getting to questions, if there are any questions, just some of the things that we identified is that these really helped us to zoom out. It helped our students to be able to formulate arguments more easily, that we were able to give more targeted feedback, because we could give feedback not just on a full paper, but on specific points of the research process. And that the interactive scaffolding, the ability to create the scaffolds for students and then move things around, was really essential. It was visual and helpful. So with that, I think we have a minute for questions, if there are any questions on what we did.
Thank you both so much.
Yeah, thank you for what we had to say.
All
We look
right.
forward